none of you have seen a case where the mother is telling that my baby is peeing not from the tip of the penis, but somewhat below. Somewhat below the tip of the penis. So the peeing starts with much drops first, then comes into a projectile flow. At the end also, there are much drops coming out, and at the peeing end. Alright. Do you have any idea about this case? What is happening? What is happening to a baby or the kid? Have you seen such a case? Have you ever seen such a case? There is another case which is called ectopia vesicae, where there is a deficiency of the anterior abdominal wall, and you can see the interior of the bladder, that is the tribune of the bladder, from outside. This is called ectopia vesicae. But dropping of urine from the opening which is close to the anterior abdominal wall, anteriorly, above the penis. This is called epispadias, which is found rarely. It is found rarely, right? So the first case that I described was the hypospadias. This one is the epispadias, and the deficient anterior abdominal wall and the deficient anterior wall of the bladder. This is known as the ectopia vesicae. Now you haven't encountered none of these cases. Alright. Now you need to understand, quite no one has the understanding, as you are deficient in your clinical classes. There is no clinical classes for you, so you are already behind your curriculum. Now in the tail fold of the gut, in the tail fold of the embryo, the hindgut is enclosed. The part of the gut that is above the allantoic diverticulum is the pre-allantoic part of the gut, and below the allantoic diverticulum it is called the post-allantoic part. Both are these two parts are forming the endodermal cloaca. As I have told you earlier, that endodermal cloaca is the source of eggs that you eat, where both the intestinal part and the urogenital part both ends in the endodermal cloaca of the hens, not cocks. Endodermal cloaca of the hens. There is formation of a septum by double fold of the endoderm that gives rise to the formation of a common cloacal duct in between the endodermal cloaca and the rectum. And when this common cloacal duct is limited by this sagittally oriented partition, which reaches up to the perineal membrane, that is the urogenital membrane, then it is completed. This job is completed. It starts, the endodermal cloaca starts organization, further organization, that is the pre-allantoic and post-allantoic part. Pre-allantoic part is tubular, post-allantoic part is dilated, and from there the sagittally oriented partition develops by dual fold of endoderm, and then there is a communication between the endodermal cloaca, the vesicae, and with the rectum, right? this starts by around fifth week and completes by 7th week, whereby the partition touches the perineal membrane and it becomes the perineal body. You will be needed to learn what is perineal body, right? Now this division gives rise to 3 parts of the endodermal cloaca, which is now urogenital sinus, because the rectal part is not there. Urogenital sinus gives rise to number 1 vesico-urethral part, number 2 is the tubular pelvic part, and next is the wider phallic part, right? You need to understand this.
sinus and the rectum with the urogenital
membrane and the anal membrane. This starts from 5th week and completes by 7th week, and the partition when touches the urogenital membrane, this becomes the perineal body. This becomes the perineal body and the partition is completed. Within this partition, there are 4 ducts. Number 2, paramesonephric or the Mullerian ducts in the center, and on either side there is the mesonephric duct or the Wolffian duct, right, within this septum. And this mesonephric duct, the end of the mesonephric duct attaches with the pelvic part of the urogenital sinus, and the Mullerian duct, that is the paramesonephric duct, attaches to the phallic part of the urogenital sinus, giving rise to the formation of the Mullerian eminence. Now you see, fold. All right. In the midline, there is the, in the median plane, there is the genital tubercle, and on either side, that is the genital swelling. Right. At the base, there is the urogenital membrane. There is urogenital membrane, which is continuous with the anterior abdominal wall. Originally, there is the mesoderm. All right. Mesoderm is coming from the primitive streak on either from either side of the endodermal cloaca. This is completing the infra-umbilical part of the anterior abdominal wall. Right. After the rupture of the urogenital membrane, there is a groove on the undersurface of the penile penis. Right. In case of female, this rupture remains as such, and the floor is not repaired. Right. And on either side, the genital swelling from the labia majora, and then the genital fold, that is the primitive urethra fold, from the labia minora, and in between the two labia minora forms the vestibule, where the urethra opens just below the clitoris. Done. Now, in case of male, the floor, the ruptured urogenital membrane in the floor is never repaired. That is never repaired. Instead, the phallic part of the urogenital sinus that enters the enlarged genital tubercle, which is now phallus, and in the floor there is the formation of a urethral groove. Formation of urethral groove, and there is a non-canalized urethral plate at first. Later on, there is canalization of the urethral plate, which communicates with the genital folds or urethral folds. Thereafter, it forms the definitive urethral groove. And this urogenital sinus stops at the base of the glans penis. It stops at the base of the glans penis. The last part, that is from the glans penis to the permanent urethral opening, this part is done by the ectodermal groove, forming of an ectodermal groove, and this urogenital sinus communicates with this ectodermal groove, completing the floor and the continuity. Right. So, the part within the penile part up to the base of the glans penis is formed from the groove from the undersurface of the penile part. All right. And the last part, which is formed by the ectodermal groove, and the ends at the permanent urethral opening. Right. Now, if you divide the structure of the urethra up to the seminal vesicle, this is done by the dorsal wall is done by the mesoderm of the bladder.Hypospadias, and after the anterior wall is done by the endoderm of the dorsal wall is done by the mesoderm of the bladder.Hypospadias, and the ventral wall is done by the endoderm of the vesico-urethral part of the bladder. Right. This is the vesico-urethral part of the urogenital sinus. Sorry. All right. Below that level, the colliculus seminalis, that is the end of prosthetic part of the urethra. This colliculus seminalis is formed by the lower end of the mesonephric duct, and the prosthetic utricle is done by the Mullerian duct, that is the paramesomethric duct, which connects with the phallic part of the urogenital sinus, forming the Mullerian eminence. Around, if the layer ruptures around the Mullerian eminence, that is the lower two end of the paramesomethric duct, there will be the formation of vagina. There will be the formation of vagina. So the part, the anterior wall is formed by the vesico-urethral part of the bladder. Next, the spongy urethra. Spongy urethra is formed by the endoderm of the urogenital sinus. Both the pelvic part and the membranous urethra is also formed by the endodermal layer from the urogenital sinus. Okay? So dorsal wall from the mesoderm of the bladder triangle, ventral wall by the vesico-urethral part of the urogenital sinus. Next is the phallic part, that is continued up to the just beyond the glans penis, and at the glans penis you will see the ectodermal groove, which is lined by stratified squamous epithelium, and spongy part of the urethra is lined by stratified columnar epithelium, and vesico-urethral part you will see there will be transitional epithelium, because it behaves more like to urinary bladder. So the part at the level of proximal part of the prostatic part is the lined by transitional epithelium, right. In the spongy part of urethra you will see that is the stratified columnar epithelium, and the part at the glans is lined by stratified squamous epithelium, right. Now the understanding of this canalization at the within the mesoderm. This canalization is within the mesoderm. Urogenital membrane, genital folds comes to repair this groove, and this groove extends from posterior to anterior, just proximal to the glans penis. Now the terminal part, that is the final or permanent aperture at this of the urethra, is at the tip of the glans penis. At this part is known as it is done by the ectoderm, and this is known as the balanic type. This is known as the balanic part. So in case of defects, we see defects of the urethral development. We see number one, the hypospadias, the epispadias, ectopia vesicae, and the extroversion of the urinary bladder. So epispadias, hypospadias, ectopia vesicae, and the extroversion of the urinary bladder, right. These four types of thing we see. In case of the hypospadias, we see number one, balanic type, that is at the glans penis, and then the penile type, that is at the body of the penis, and the perineal type, that is in front of the anterior abdominal wall at the close to the root of the penis, right. And in case of the ectopia vesicae, we see there is absence of symphysis pubis, but we will look for whether there is absence of symphysis pubis, right. Together with there will be absence of the deficient anterior abdominal wall due to poor migration of mesodermal unit from the primitive stick. This is primitive stick, this is the primitive stick, and from there muscles comes to the anterior abdominal wall. When this is deficient, there will be deficiency in the intra-umbilical part of the abdomen, right? And there will be absent symphysis pubis, right? So Hypospadias, epispadias, ectopia vesicae, and the extroversion, all right, not extroversion, together with ectopia vesicae. These 4 types of abnormality we find. Now, in case of penile type, the groove on the undersurface of the penis, it is not fused on the anterior aspect. This is the perineal type. This is the penile type. And in case of the perineal type, the entire length remains unfused. Entire length remains unfused, just like female. And at the anterior, you will see the diminished size of the genital tubercle that gives rise to the phallus. In case of male, the 2 folds outside the rupture, after rupture of the urogenital membrane, there is a groove formation which is not repaired in case of the female, and 2 folds, that is the genital folds and the genital swelling. Genital folds give rise to the labia minora, and in between this is the vestibule, where opens the vagina as well as the urethral orifice just below the clitoris. In case of the perineal type, you will see there is complete absence of fusion of this urethral groove on the undersurface of the phallus. This groove is not repaired in case of female. So the labia majora, labia minora, these remain separated. But in case of male, this groove is repaired. This groove is repaired from posterior to anterior direction, and the urethral plate that attaches with the genital folds, giving rise to definitive urethral groove, that gives rise to the formation of the part of the urethra up to the glans penis, that gives rise to the urethra, part of the urethra up to the glans penis. Beyond the glans penis, there is an ectodermal groove. Beyond the glans penis, there is an ectodermal groove. So dorsal wall of the prostatic part of the urethra, that is from the mesoderm. Ventral wall is by the endoderm from the vesico-urethral part of the urogenital sinus. Then comes the pelvic part, that comes from the endoderm of the pelvic part of the urogenital sinus. Then the phallic part, which has entered into the developing phallus, right? Now, one experience you will definitely observe. If you are asked to catheterize a female, it is a tough job for male doctors. It is a tough job for male doctors, but even it is tough for the female doctor. Now, how will you find the opening of urethra in case of female? What is the destination? How we can find it? Number one, you have to look at the vestibule between the opposite layers of the labia minora, and you have to find a single large opening below the clitoris. You will find that there are 4, 5, 6, 7 openings. But one of the, yes, just below the clitoris you will find 4, 5, 6, 7, any kind of opening. The large one is, the large one below the clitoris is the urethral opening, right. In case of male it is not that much tough, alright. Now the other thing is the vesico-vaginal fistula. In case of underdeveloped country like ours, the main cause of vesico-vaginal fistula is the post-parturition. But in case of Western countries, it is the gynecological surgery, operation in the perineum, pelvic floor, and cancer with radiational injury. So what are those? There is a gynecological surgery, surgery of the pelvic floor, perineum, and the radiational injury in case of cancer cervix or whatever, ovarian tumor or whatever, right. Now how can you locate where the fistula is? How can you locate where the fistula is? Other than doing MRI, CT, contrast CT, through coarse method, how can you diagnose the location of the fistula? Any idea? All are important. But tell me simple method by which you will be able to locate where the fistula is. Put some cotton swab or gauze swab as tampons and put some colored fluid within the bladder, either carmine or ginseng violet, and follow the urinary flow and take out the gauze piece or swab that you have put like tampon. Then you will be able to understand, due to the coloring fluid, that this is the site of leakage, this is the site of leakage, this is the site of leakage. The most leakage is at the level of neck of the bladder. Most leakage is at the level of the neck of the bladder. Other sites are not easy to diagnose until and unless you do a contrast CT, MRI or cystoscopy. Done? So things you need to know along with hypospadias. There are other two problems always run, that is the bifid scrotum and undescended testes. When you see bifid scrotum, undescended testes and malformed penis, this is known as male pseudo hermaphroditism. Male pseudo hermaphroditism, undescended testes, malformed penis and the hypospadias. This triad forms the male pseudo hermaphroditism. Okay, as if the baby is a female one, not a male. That's why it is called male pseudo hermaphroditism. Okay, let me conclude.